In this chapter, we're going to do a little sidestep and focus in a little bit more of a sociological view of biology, but still irrelevant in the grand scheme of the things that we're talking about, because in the biology of criminology, so the study of wrongful convictions and why people do the things that they do, we do talk about traits, and we do talk about genetics, and we do talk about environment, and how all of those things help to cultivate one's behavior in the world. And so there's definitely some genetics and inheritance considerations here, but above and beyond that, there have been a lot of advances in biology which have aided the pursuit of truth in criminology, basically meaning that an effort to reduce how many people are wrongfully convicted. There are diagnostic tools now available to help better determine one's identity and to link them to a crime, so that people are not wrongfully accused just based upon bias and ill will. So all interesting components here in criminology that require a little bit of thought in the field of biology. Okay, to begin, one of the questions that one might ask when we're talking about the biology of criminology is nature versus nurture. This is a very important question. It's a very difficult question to answer. How much of our behavior is due to nature, basically meaning the way that we're born, and that would all be a genetic component that we really can't control, and how much of our behavior is based upon the way that we are raised. So this would be more of like our environment. To answer this question, we have to first understand that traits are not as simple as we've previously described them in pea plants and such, where there's just a simple trait and that trait has a simple gene that determines the trait, and the genes are going to be inherited according to Mendelian patterns of inheritance. Most traits, specifically when we're talking about a complex organism like a human, are going to be traits that are influenced by more than one gene. So any gene that is, or any trait that is determined by multiple genes, we would call a polygenic trait. Okay. An example would be eye color, and previously we've made it sound that eye color is really just a simple trait that's inherited. It's either dominant or recessive, and making it sound like there's only one gene. There's actually 16 genes that help to code for eye color. Two of the most important ones are found right here on chromosome 15, just below the centromere here, HER2 and OCA2. There are a bunch of others, and in that sense, eye color would be considered a polygenic trait. Okay, quantitative traits then are those traits which are influenced by many genes, so they are indeed polygenic, but above and beyond that, they are also influenced by the environment. And so then we get into this nature versus nurture dilemma here, because there are the traits that are informed by the genome, and they're also influenced by the environment. Generally, these types of traits will exhibit what's known as continuous variation. So rather than being just like a one recessive phenotype versus a dominant phenotype, because there are so many genes at play and so many factors in the environment at play, it creates so many different phenotypes that they generally will have a broad spectrum of phenotypes. A good example of this is skin color, because there's a wide array of skin colors that can be possible, all depending on how much melanin is produced in the skin. And that is definitely a genetic component. You're born with a proclivity towards a darker complexion of skin or a lighter complexion of skin, but also your skin color can be influenced by your environment. The more generally that you would be out in the sun, the more melanin is released, causing a little bit of a darker skin color. And so because of the fact that there are lots of different genes which create a lot of different shades of skin, and those shades of skin can furthermore become lighter or darker based upon the environment, how much exposure to sun they've had, then there's just a wide array of skin color out there. So a continuous variation. And it is funny that this is the very idea that Gregor Mendel was was arguing against when he did his pea plant studies, and he was able to contradict this theory in something simple like a pea plant for simple traits. But again, those that are of many genes and formed by the environment, it does generally form phenotypes in a broad spectrum. Okay, oftentimes these types of traits, quantitative traits, will form a normal distribution in the population. So another example of a trait such as this, a quantitative trait, would be the height of an individual. So this is a graph showing the average height of men in the USA. And so what we're seeing here, this would be like the percent of people. So you can see that by far the highest percent of people, so about 40% of all adult men, are about 70 inches tall. A normal distribution is one where we do see kind of a bell curve like this. And that would be different than like if we had a curve here and a curve here. That would not be considered a normal distribution, where you had a lot of short people and then no middle height people, like middle height individuals, and then tall people. So generally quantitative traits will, if they are formed from a lot of genes and the environmental factors and they're mixed in a population, there will be some sort of average. And then as we get away, in the average is the one that has the most abundant number of individuals of that phenotype. So in this case, men that are 70 inches would be the majority of men. And then these are called standard deviations. So basically, anytime you have a normal distribution, if you go, basically this is saying that 34.5% plus 34.5%, so that would be 68% about of all individuals are going to be found inside of these two standard deviations, one going this way and one going this way. In other words, 68% of all people will be of heights that are 67 and 73 inches. A standard deviation is the height in this example at which we're now 34.5% away on either side of the population. And then if we keep going further, there'd be another standard deviation that's 13.6% away. So meaning of all the people now that are between 64 and 76 inches of adult height, they would be 68 plus 26% of the population all fit within those two standard deviations. Okay. And then generally in a normal distribution of traits that are quantitative, the more extreme, so really, really tall or really, really short, will have fewer members in that group. So it's like there's a lot present in the average height, and then on either extreme, it's much more uncommon. Where these standard deviations fall, like in this graph here, the first standard deviation is falling at 67 inches and 73 inches. That can change depending on the population, and that gets us to this idea of what's known as variance. Variance refers to how wide the curve is. It could be that the curve looks like this, or it could be that the curve looks something more like this, so to speak. So there's a much greater variance in the phenotypes, or it could be that the curve is a little bit shorter like this. There's a much more narrow variance in all of the different phenotypes possible, in this case heights of an individual. So where the standard deviations lie, will change depending on the population, but nevertheless a standard deviation would be one that goes 34% this way or 34% this way in terms of the entire population. So 68% of the population will always be within the first two standard deviations, so to speak. That's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm hoping you to know in this class. But anytime you see SD anywhere, it means standard deviation, and it basically tells you, if there's a number for standard deviation, it tells you what these values are for whatever the trait is that you're assessing, or whatever the metric is that you're assessing. It's basically telling you what is the point, how far away from the average is the first standard deviations of 34.1% of the population on either side. Okay, good little tidbit of info there if you ever take stats, but we won't really use that a lot in our class. Okay, another interesting component here that is just a little background is this concept of heritability. So heritability basically is the specific attempt to determine how much of the genome affects a trait versus environmental. So for any quantitative trait, whether it be skin tone or height of an individual, if we are looking to determine the trait's heritability, we are looking to determine how much of that trait is affected by the genome versus the environment. So this is the attempt to figure out nature versus nurture. Okay, this is a difficult thing to do. There's lots of complex correlations and such that have to take place in order to give us a metric of heritability, and I still don't really even quite understand how it's done. It's a little beyond me, but there are people that do attempt to figure out the heritability of certain traits. And in this particular chapter, one of the questions could be asked, how much does the genome influence wrongful behavior? Okay, so if we consider perhaps one's proclivity to anger, or one's the percentage of people that commit violent crimes, for example, what percentage of that trait is affected by the genome? Well, there's an interesting study that has assessed this question, and what they did is they took a large survey of twins and evaluated their criminal behavior. Now, twins are a good model for studying this question because there are monozygotic twins, which would be identical twins. So they have the same genome. So if there's any difference between identical twins and how they behave, it has to be due to their environment, because they have the exact same genome, if that makes sense. There's also dizygotic twins, which are non-identical, so they have pretty much the same environment because they were born at the same time in the same family, raised, together at the same age, going through all of the grades and in school and such at the same time. So they lived very similar environments. And so both monozygotic and dizygotic twins, in other words, identical and fraternal twins, have the same environment, roughly speaking. It's just that the monozygotic twins also have an identical genome. So the thought is that you can compare the difference between the behavior of identical and non-identical twins to get an idea of what this factor here of having the same genome, how it would play out. And that is basically the essence of what this study was seeking to accomplish. And they did it by looking at prevalence of crime. So here we have monozygotic and dizygotic twins, so identical twins and fraternal twins for males, and then the same for females, and then fraternal twins contrasting male versus female. And if we look, this shows the number of pairs that they had. So it's a huge study going many, many decades. And so you've got, you have close to 3,000 sets of twins in each of these sample sizes. And then if we look, we can compare the total percent of those individuals who were convicted of various crimes. So in essence, about 15% of all of the individuals who were identical twins had committed crimes, and then this is basically how the subtypes are identified here. And then 15.7% of the fraternal twins had committed crimes, and then you can see it's much less in the females. So we can then make an attempt to try and figure out a little bit about how much of the genome is influenced here by comparing in correlations the difference between the behavior of monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. Now, this is something I don't really quite understand because it would seem to me that we can't just lump all of these twins in one group. and lump all of these twins in this group and compare the two groups, because all of the twin pairs, even though they are identical twins, because we're looking at many different types of identical twins, they all have different environments. So there isn't really much of anything different here between the identical twins and the fraternal twins when you're looking at large populations, because all of these twins will have different environments, and all these twins will have different environments. So I'm not exactly sure really how they did this study, or maybe I'm not smart enough to figure it out. But there's the textbook will say that they make this claim here that correlations of criminality between different types of twins yielded a heritability of 0.55. And in other words, 55% of the variability in criminality among humans is due to genetic differences. And so basically what they're saying is the difference between these two, which is only about 1%, less than 1%, if you run a bunch of complex statistical analyses, it will show that the difference between these, 55% of that difference is accounted best for by genetic differences. So in other words, they're alluding to the fact that there might be a significant genetic component here between the variability and criminality among humans. But they also, the authors here, if we go on, they'll make an important note that even though there might be a genetic component, we have to be really careful about how we apply that sentiment, because there are a lot of different scenarios where it might appear that there's a genetic component, but then in the context of different environments, the fact of that, the significance of that genetic component goes away, and they allude to a study of mice put on rich diets and non-rich diets of food, and how they affected their weight gain, and then when they changed the environment, the genetic component seemed to dissolve, so to speak. Okay, so this represents some attempts here for us to try and take a stab at determining the influence of nature versus nurture on human behavior in the context of criminology. And through all of this, it's very interesting to consider the question nature versus nurture, but I think there's a much more important question here that we need to get to the root of, and this is a question that inevitably intersects with our philosophical predispositions. So there are several instances in biology where we cannot escape wrestling with our philosophical predisposition, because how we view the data and our conclusions from it is completely dependent upon our philosophical predisposition. And this is one of those arenas, and I think it's a very, very important arena to discuss, because it really gets to the heart of what I think is our purpose in the world and some of the main tenets of the Christian faith. So let me just try and help parse out where that philosophical predisposition is, and how it manifests itself here, even in something such as the study of biology of human behavior. So something like a general textbook of biology would, in the discussion of nature versus nurture, paint this type of picture where essentially there's the genome, and the genome builds the body. So your entire body, the way that your brain is wired, and how all of your organs are connected to it, and thereby the way that you think and process the world, and the things that you like and the things that you don't like, and the things that you're able to do and not able to do, and your proclivity for different attributes in the world. Those are all determined by how your brain is built and how your brain interacts with your body, and that's all determined by, ultimately, your genome. Okay? Then there's also the environment in which you are found. So if you grew up in a certain home, your brain might engage in one way, and if you grew up in a different home, your brain might engage in another way. Even the things like the foods that you eat, and the study habits that you have that can all affect the way that your brain is developing. And so your environment will affect your body, and in turn, your body, through the workings of your brain as it's churning about in the environment, can also influence and change your environment. Perhaps you decide to move away from the town that you are in, or perhaps you decide to stop doing some sort of devastating behavior or something like that. But ultimately, the only thing that really exists in this context that affects human behavior is your body as determined by your genome and your environment. So this would be nature versus nurture, and nothing else. And here is behavior. But all of this has one very grand assumption. And that assumption is that nature and nurture are all that really exist and all that really affect your behavior. So consider this. What if it was the case that there was your body, and their body was made by your genome? I don't think we should dispute that. Okay, and also there is your environment, and both your body and your environment will affect things. But then there is you, and what you is, whether it be your soul or your spirit or your mind, whatever it is, when you call yourself you, when you say I, whatever that thing is, what if that was separate from your body? Then what could be the case is that your body could influence you. The temptations that you have, the proclivity to an addiction of some kind, or the way that you behave is determined by the way that your brain is wired, and so it does influence heavily, probably, you and your behavior. There's also your environment, the parents that you had or didn't have, and the church community that maybe you were in, or the school that you were in, and whatnot. That also influences you. But at the end of the day, there is a you of which these two things can influence, but then ultimately it's you that decides what your behavior is going to be. These are two very, very different pictures of human behavior, because in the one, it assumes that you are your body. There is no other thing that's you attached to your body. And so if that's the case, then really the only two factors here influencing behavior are your body, which is determined by your genome, and your environment. Well, you can't determine your genome. You have no control over your genome. And if you have no control of your genome, you have no control on the body that's built, which means you actually have no control on how your body affects your environment, and you have no control of your environment that you're born in, and so you have no control over the environment here. So how could you possibly ever be held morally responsible for your behavior if all of your behavior is determined by things that are outside of your control? It doesn't make any sense. And so this is a huge philosophical assumption here that I think it doesn't explain how we feel in the universe. It doesn't explain how we treat people. It doesn't explain our justice system. It doesn't explain how we have a tendency to hold people morally responsible for their actions. If you are your body, then there's just, you have no control over your behavior, and so why would we ever hold you morally responsible for that? I can't understand that. Okay, in this scenario, though, you are not your body, though you may be a part of it. Okay, your body is definitely influencing you. How tethered your body is to you, I'm not sure. But in this type of scenario, because there is something distinct from the body that is completely determined by your genome, and the environment which you have no control of, now you do have moral responsibility. It may be that your body makes it much harder for you to do one thing than it does for another thing. Maybe your brain is wired such that it loves to consume high amounts of sugary pop or soda. And so it makes it very difficult for you not to consume those things, much more difficult than maybe somebody else. But you still nonetheless do have a choice, even if that choice is much harder for you in that particular context than somebody else. And similarly, other things might be much easier for you than somebody else. And similarly, your environment. If you love Krispy Kreme donuts and you live in a house where your siblings are always bringing them home and putting them on the table for you to eat, that's going to be much harder for you to not eat those Krispy Kreme donuts, right? But you still do have the choice. There is a morally responsible you. And by the way, I'm not trying to bash Krispy Kreme donuts here because, if you put that box in front of me, I'm gonna eat the whole doggone thing, okay? But I'm just trying to make the point that some of us in our struggles may be drawn to engage the struggle more forcefully if there are different conditions that create more temptation. This is, I think, a picture of this is a picture of the world in which we live that I think is much more accurate. It explains why we do hold people morally accountable to their actions. It explains why you do feel like you have a real free will. And here, there's no free will. Free will is just an illusion. All behavior is determined by things that you ultimately have no control of. Here, you do have a free will, and it's not just an illusion. You actually can choose, and you can choose to do things that are contrary to the influences of your body and your environment. This is, I believe, a tenet of the Christian faith, to have a philosophy that looks more like this. We see this time and time again in the New Testament. This is the war between the flesh and the spirit. There is you, which I think is spirit, or is a soul, or is a mind. And sometimes your body will encourage you to want to do things that you don't necessarily know or feel are correct, but you do them anyways because it's such a strong influence. I mean, we are tethered to this body. And similarly, your environment might encourage you to do things that run counter to the moral standard that God has put upon His kingdom, right? And so there's this tension. Are we going to align ourselves with the desires of our body? That is to say, are we going to identify not as a soul, but instead as just a mere animal body that's determined by a genome? Or are we going to, despite all of these influences which might pull us away from what we know to be right, are we going to pursue the thing that we feel is correct, the spiritual truth, the spiritual way of living? That is, in essence, the Christian faith. And there aren't many other faiths, actually none that I really know of off the top of my head, where this is the scenario, where there's this struggle or this war between your spiritual identity and your animal identity. And the Bible is pretty clear that if we choose to identify not as something that comes from God, and thus is subject to a higher standard, if we choose to act more like an animal and declare that there is no God and really all we are is just an advanced animal, and so that we are now licensed to behave exactly as the body and its instincts shall determine, then we're tethering ourselves to a reality that is not full. It's not the complete picture of what God has intended for us. And there's plenty of scriptures that talk about this. This one from Romans 8, I think, says it most succinctly. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But to those who live according to the Spirit, they set their minds on things of the Spirit. And there are plenty of places that say the same analogy, that to identify as yourself with an animal and pursue all of those animal instincts that will lead to death. To pursue your identity as a son or daughter of God in His eternal kingdom. And God is a spirit, and thus we are also of a spiritual nature. That is to bring life. It's the war against the flesh and the spirit. And we see a whole bunch. Just thumb through your New Testament, especially in the book of Romans and Galatians. You'll see tons of talk about the war between the spirit and the flesh. This is the Christian's plight and the Christian's battle. And fortunately for us, the battle has been won, because God, the mind of God, comes to dwell on earth take on flesh as like an animal and an animal body, but then overcome that identity and lead us to the path of salvation, which will lead us back to the place that he has prepared for us. Our true identity as sons or daughters of God, not merely animals of this world that perish. And in all of this discussion, there's some really great arguments to be made for the Christian faith. One of the best I've ever come across is laid out in C.S. Lewis' book, Mere Christianity. So if you haven't read this book, I mean, this is one book I would recommend all Christians to read at some point in their life. It's really, really great. The first 40 or 50 or 60 pages is where Lewis will spell out his presentation of the moral argument, which I find very, very convincing. And I'll spare you the details now. I'll let you read it on your own if you like. But in either case, this whole idea of the fact that we do hold people morally accountable, and that doesn't make sense in the context of just all of us being animals led by our instincts, that's a good argument to make a strong case, I think, for the validity of at least a spiritual realm, and even more so probably a validity of a spiritual realm that aligns more with how the New Testament and the Old Testament would describe it. Okay, that concludes some of the complex intersection between philosophy and biology, and also faith. From here, we're going to get back on the rails, and we're going to talk more about just some simple, well, not really quite simple, I would say, but more straightforward scientific techniques. So stay tuned for part 2 of this chapter, where I'll explain some of these techniques which are now being used to help solve crimes, and also to help ensure that people are not wrongfully convicted of crime.